Look at line 1458. It's on either page 277 or 312. You get this. And you, Orestes, learn my bidding, my epistolas, could almost be my letter. You hear my voice, the voice of a goddess, though you are not present. Fare on with the image and your sister. When you come to God-built Athens, there is a place in the furthest confines of Attica, near the Carystian rock, a holy place which my people call Helley. Build a temple there and set up the image to be named after the Taurian land, and your agonized, toilsome wanderings up and down Greece, goaded on by the furies. For the future mortals shall hymn her as Artemis, the Taurian goddess. Establish too this law: whenever the folk keep this festival as compensation for your life spared at the altar, let the priest apply the knife to the neck of some man and let him let blood. And your translation has, for religion's sake, it's literally another form of Hosiohenica, it's Hosias Hecate, for form's sake, or for the sake of the holy, that the goddess may have her honors. So this is very close to the end of the play. You could say the end result of the play is establishing a ritual, a new ritual. Hosias Hecate, for the sake of the holy, literally, idiomatically, for form's sake. Now, ritual means preserving the significance of something done without preserving the actual doing of it. So, for example, the blood here that's drawn from the knife will stand for human sacrifice without actually being human sacrifice. The problem, though, is this. When the actual doing is repeatedly omitted, the ritual risks losing its meaning. So, Hosias Hecate, for the sake of the holy, drifts into meaning for form's sake. You get something that's done because it's done, not for any other reason. So you could say a ritual cut free from its reality is a little bit like Iphigenia's dream at the beginning of the play, with its various possible interpretations, as we will see today when we look at it, of the red atop the cornice of the building, of the house of Atreus. So her dream requires interpretation. It's not univocal. Start over. Any ritual, any festival, any symbolic action, at the same time points to its meaning on the one hand, and on the other hand is something in its own right. So, for example, killing Greek men among the Taurians is a sign, on the one hand, of vengeance for the sacrifice of Iphigenia. So if you look at line 337, that's perfectly explicit. You get, hold on, you get this. Pray, maiden, that other strangers as fine as these be sent as victims to your altar A few more like these to slaughter, and Hellas will pay in full for slaughtering you, will pay the penalty for the sacrifice at Aulis. So on the one hand, it's perfectly explicit that killing Greek men is meant to be a sign of vengeance for the sacrifice of Iphigenia. But on the other hand, it's also actually killing Greek men. It's not simply what its significance is. So as a sign, it evens up the score. They did this to you, we're doing that to them. As a deed in its own right, it of course creates a new demand for vengeance. Or you could imagine this. Imagine a conversation between Agamemnon and Clytemnestra. Clytemnestra would say, "You murdered my daughter." Agamemnon would say, "Well, no, not really. I sacrificed her to Artemis. You, Clytemnestra, see only the action, but you don't understand what it meant." Or at the end, when Orestes and Pylades and Iphigenia escape, how do they escape? They escape by making an action look like a ritual. She says to Thoas, these guys are matricides and they touch the statue and everything has to be purified. So you hold everybody inside. We're going down to the sea to dip these guys and the statue into the sea to purify it. One of the two uses of catharsis in the Poetics is Aristotle describing what they do here, the purification of the statue. So think about it from Thoas's point of view. He never doubts what's happening. I mean, it's perfectly clear. He only later learns that it meant something very different from what he thought it meant. But the actual action of walking down to the sea and getting in the sea, the two guys and the statue, it's the same as it would have been if Iphigenia had been telling the truth. Now, this ritual is, of course, especially complicated. Iphigenia says, "Oh, I know how we can get away. Let's pretend it's a purification. But really, it's going to be an escape." But underneath it all, it is what's necessary for Orestes' purification. It's what Apollo sent him to the land of the Taurians to do. So the doubleness is completed when Orestes lifts Iphigenia into the boat and she's holding the statue of Artemis. So Orestes has done exactly what Apollo told him to do. He says, and it's so wonderful because in Greek, if you want to talk about your sister, you can say the sister. Well, at precisely the right moment, Apollo is said to have said, "Save the sister," which could mean, of course, the statue of Artemis, and it could mean Iphigenia. It could be Apollo's sister, and it could be Orestes' sister. So he does both of these in one action. The action itself has a kind of duplicity to it. Now, the end of the play reinforces this point about ritual, because you could put it this way. All the action of this play becomes meaningless at the end. Even though they fail, Athena saves them. That's what it means to have a deus ex machina come in and save the day. I don't mean Athena, I do mean Athena. So everything they've done in the play has been hosias hecate, for form's sake. The end, when Athena comes in and says, "Well, you did everything wrong, but I'm going to get you out of this mess anyway," turns every action into the play into a sort of performance that's meant to have significance, but at the expense of reality. You can see that if you just say, Well, if they had known in advance that Athena would come anyway, you could imagine them going through the motions for their meaning, knowing the foreordained result, but not, and therefore not really risking anything. Now, Euripides has really done this already at the start of the play by making Iphigenia alive. Agamemnon didn't really kill her. Therefore, Clytemnestra kills him for what the sacrifice meant. She doesn't kill him for what he actually did. She killed him because he meant to sacrifice Iphigenia, and that was monstrous. So my hypothesis for the play really is this. Tragedy is the process of restoring the reality to ritual. Interesting to try that out on the 3 rituals mentioned at the end of this play. To restore the reality to ritual so as to endow it with significance. But it can't really restore the reality. And therefore, tragedy turns out to be a ritual restoration of the reality that underlies ritual by providing a story that gives it a power that it previously didn't have. This, I think, Euripides wants to say, is the distinguishing feature of Greekness over and against barbarianism. And he means by Greekness, being a Greek, being Greco-centered, a civilization. It's the sign of civilization, this presence of ritual. So you could say, I mean, on the one hand, he has in mind something simple. We don't know because we don't know enough to know, historically to know what the status is of this cutting of the throat every year in a ceremony at Helley. Imagine that it exists in Athens at that time, but nobody has a clue why. I mean, they sort of have a clue. It's about, and so they don't know what it's all about. Why does some guy have to go up and have his throat nicked every year? What's the point? What's the point of all that? It's just for form's sake. It happens every year, but we don't have a clue what it means. And then someone like Euripides comes along and says, I'll tell you what it means. It means human sacrifice, and you have to think through what human sacrifice really amounts to, and I'm going to show you what it amounts to in a tragedy in order that you can restore the sense of danger when you shake hands with someone. Right? So initially it means you shake hands and it's a big deal because you're saying, I won't kill you with my sword. But now it's just, hiya, or, I mean, and then what happens? I mean, it's interesting. I don't know if the Germans still do it. The Germans used to shake hands constantly. But my guess is that it's sort of fallen by the way, because it had a kind of real seriousness to it. It was an acknowledgement of the other as another. And then last time I was there, I mean, people were doing this, probably doesn't bother you. It just bothers people like me. When you go to the doctor's office and you're waiting there for much too long a time, and they say, Michael, or sometimes even Mike. I mean, nobody's called me Mike since my mother, and I'm not a kid any longer, so I haven't heard that in a long time. So there's a level of formality that gets dropped once the form of acknowledging the other as other gets dropped. But it's sort of built into the familiarity that you don't even understand what the form was meant for initially. So Euripides comes along and says, oh, I'll tell you. And every year we're going to have tragic festivals at Athens, and people are going to show you all sorts of things that are built into the way you live, and you just don't even realize it any longer. You don't even understand what the significance of these moments are. But I'll show you ritually what they are, and you will know that you'll somehow learn something important, because you'll be forced to think about why people would even think about sacrificing other people to the gods. So that looks to be what Euripides' overall project is in terms of what it is that tragedy does. Well, we'll see. I mean, the question is it a ritual for the Taurians? So the question really depends on whether it's understood symbolically or actually. So it turns out that in fact, she has to learn this as well. So this is an unfolding of what it means to understand what a ritual is. At the beginning of the play, in a way, nobody's a Greek. By the end of the play, Euripides has, in a way, announced what it means to be a Greek. Among other things, by the way, it turns out that there's a kind of doubleness involved in being a Greek. And, you know, we've already seen that in the Bacchae, the double vision. That's the nice side of it. The not so nice side of it in this play comes out as, oh, that's a very Greek thing to do, and that means a duplicitous thing, a sly thing. I think the big deal is that Thoas runs fast and his name means fast. That there is no difference among the Taurians between what you're named and what you are. And ritual requires an acknowledgement of the difference. You see this as a certain similarity to something we've been talking about upstairs all semester. My favorite photograph that I will pull out for you again, this 50-year-old photograph of my wife, and I say that's my wife, and you all know by now it is and it is not. And it's a necessary feature of it that it is and is not my wife. It can't be an image of my wife unless it actually represents her, but it can't be an image of my wife if it's not distinct from her. It has to be her and not be her at the same time. So rituals, images, being able to see a ritual as a ritual, being able to see an image as an image, turns out to be very important. What happens to you when you sit in the theater on the side of the Acropolis and you see a performance and are moved by it? Because on the one hand, you're moved by it and it's real, and on the other hand, it's not real, and it cannot be real. And the claim that Euripides seems to be making for that kind of experience is that's what it really means to be a civilized human being. I remember there's a scene, there must be a scene like this in dozens of plays, but what's it in? I think it's in the musical Showboat. There's a performance on stage and something's happening to, the heroine on stage, and this guy jumps down from this backwoodsman jumps down from the balcony and tries to save her because he can't distinguish between reality and the representation of reality. And so it turns out to be very funny because in fact he's mistaken an image for the real thing. But very, very interesting that even there, in this sort of hokey, 1930s musical probably, there's a realization that that's a sign of being a barbarian, because he's a backwoodsman, right? He's not sophisticated. being sophisticated, means somehow being able to make the distinction between reality and image. And then, of course, we know what happens with sophistication is that it goes too far, and it turns out that, you come out of the theater, you go to New York, you on one of the rare occasions, I remember this happened to me once. I went to the theater to see, I think it was Ralph Fiennes and Hamlet. And you come out of Hamlet's a great play. It's an incredible play there's so much to tax you intellectually. And, if you're just a little too sophisticated by half, the first thing you say when you come out is, oh, that was a fine performance. I really appreciated when he did X or Y. And that was one of the best Hamlets I've ever seen. And I always get really impatient with that kind of stuff because I want to talk about the other stuff, the fact that the self is necessarily the self divided against itself and all sorts of things that Shakespeare is showing you, and the sort of sophisticated detachment that allows you to evaluate it only as an image and not as what it's an image of, is the equivalent of Hosea turning into For Form's Sake, where you're actually not taking the play seriously any longer because it doesn't actually affect you at the level that it's supposed to affect you. You can't really distinguish between a fine performance of Hamlet and a rather good tea. It's the same sort of, you're a Feinschmecker, and you're sort of deciding that so you could be a little more barbaric. You'd be better off if you were a little more barbaric. On the one hand, and on the other hand, if you're too barbaric, you come lunging out of the balcony to try to save the maiden in distress, and you screw everything up. So Euripides is trying to teach you how to find the fine line between those two things. Book 7 of the Republic begins with the sentence, make an image, Glaucon, of our condition in the world. Presumably, Glaucon knows, after he's made the image, that this is an image. Doesn't mean he can do any better than that and tell you what the truth is without an image, but it does mean he's in a very different situation from someone who doesn't even know that it's an image. So the crucial thing is a weird, and Euripides and Plato agree on this, celebration of what you might call irony. The need to, on the one hand, know that what is before you is an image, and on the other hand, not dismiss it for all that. So, thank you for that, actually. That's a beautiful example. Yes, according to Plato, everything is a shadow on the cave wall, but human beings are to be distinguished by whether they are aware of that or whether they are not aware of that. Those who are not aware of that just take it to be reality, and that means when I pull out the photograph of my wife, you think it's really my wife. And you think I'm strange for getting in a long-term relationship with a piece of paper. Okay? Okay. So let's look at the text for a change. So start with line 66. We're going to come back to your question, Raphael. It's the big question of the day. Line 66. Hold on. So we have this. This is the interchange between Orestes and Pylades. Look, take care that no one is in our path. Pylades says, I am looking, I am turning my eyes and spying in every direction. Pylades, do you think this is the goddess house for which we sailed our ship over the sea from Argos? I do, Orestes, and you must think so too. And the altar where the Hellene blood drips? At any rate, What does your translation say? I can't read mine anymore. Yeah, okay. Its top is brown with bloodstains. And you see the spoils hung from the coping? I see the body, or the booty, taken from bodies of slain strangers. But I must look around and examine things more closely. So Pylades has two speeches where he seems to say more than he needs to by speaking of looking around in a double way. He uses two verbs in each sentence, and so it looks like an unnecessary repetition. I am looking, I am turning my eyes and spying in every direction. I must look around and examine. The verb there, scopein, our word scope comes from it. So originally it means something like to see. So on line 69, the verb horo, and then skopumai, and then on line 76, enkuklunta, ophthalmon, to move the eyes around, and again, scopein. So scopein, by the time it gets to Euripides' time, means to consider. It's a kind of metaphorical looking. So there seems to be a distinction in the way Pylades talks about it between seeing and really seeing, something like seeing the significance of. Now, okay, notice this other thing. He's talking about at any rate, its top is brown with blood stains. So the word for the color there, brown, is xanthos. It is also the word that's used to describe the color of the hair that sprouts from the capital of the pillar in her dream at line 52. It sprouted forth golden hair. Same word. It means sort of auburn. It's hard to know exactly what it means. It looks as though it means something like reddish, blondish, brown. And the same word is also used to indicate in the top row of stones of the altar, what he calls the coping, and on the previous page, the cornice of the house of Atreus. So just hold on to that for a bit. If we look at line 77 following, we get this. Phoebus, why have you again led me into a net with your oracles, after I avenged the blood of my father by slaying my mother? I was pursued by troops upon troops of furies far from my own land, and I covered many a course, doubling to and fro. Then I came to you and asked how I might escape from this wheel of madness and end the sufferings, the agonies that drove me up and down Hellas. You told me to come to the boundaries of the Tauric land where your bloodkin, Artemis, possessed altars, and to take from there the goddess's image, Agalma, which men say fell into this temple here from heaven. When I had got it, either by art or good luck, and the risk was run, I was to present it to the land of the Athenians. No further commands were given, and so doing I should have rest from my labors. In obedience to your words, I am come here to this unknown, this land inhospitable to strangers. So we get another sort of doubleness. I mean, he gives a description of what Apollo said to him, but he doesn't give it to us in direct discourse. We don't get a quotation, so we don't know exactly what Apollo said to him. And as I mentioned earlier, in Greek, to say my sister, one frequently says the sister. Now, the phrase here obviously applies then equally to Artemis and to Iphigenia. So, for example, we're told at 88 that Artemis's statue fell from the sky, but we're told at line 42 that that is where Iphigenia came from as well. So we don't actually know what's being referred to as having come from the sky. Well, doesn't Apollo specify the statue of the sister? That's interesting because the word that he uses initially is agalma, and it's confirmed again. He does it first at line 87, and then it gets confirmed at lines 977 to 82, where he says this. Then Phoebus uttered some sound from his golden tripod and sent me here to seize the agalma that fell from Zeus and set it up in the land of the Athenians. So it's clear that he's meant to come for the agalma on the one hand, but look at line 266. You get this. You can't blame him for translating it differently, but see if I can find it. I thought I had it. Oh, at the bottom of page 281. One of our number that was God-fearing raised his hands and looked toward them and prayed, "Child of sea goddess Laocothea, guardian of ships, Lord Palimon, be gracious unto us. Or if you are the Dioscuri that sit upon that shore, or darlings of Nereus, who begot the noble choir of 50 Nereids." The word darlings there is agalmata. You can't translate it by statues or images because it's clearly not what it means there. So it can mean statue or image, and that's certainly its first meaning where we first looked at it, but it can't mean statue or image of Nereus here. So it must have an alternate meaning, something like delight or honor or glory. That means Euripides has gone out of his way to remind us of the double meaning of the word. So he makes it clear that agalma of the gods at line 87 might mean the statue, agalma of the goddess at line 87. It might mean the darling of the statue of the goddess, namely the statue that's in the temple. It might mean the darling of the goddess. Well, who's the darling of the goddess? Well, Iphigenia was just saved from being sacrificed by Artemis, who whisked her away. So once again, we get this thoroughgoing ambiguity about what's being talked about. So Pylades sees double at this moment, and Orestes says things that have systematically double meanings, although it's not clear that he sees double. A couple of, initially at least, unconnected remarks about this section, the parados, Orestes' funeral. The chorus begin at line 123 by calling Artemis Dictuna, something like, the goddess of the chase. A dictuon is a hunting net. And this reminds us of Orestes' remark at line 77, that, let's just make sure it's translated that way. Yeah. Ah, Phoebus, why have you again led me into a net with your oracles? Reminds us of that on the one hand, and it reminds us of a later line where Orestes talks about the walls of the temple that are thrown around like a net. Now, the chorus soon identify themselves as Greek. Then Iphigenia begins by addressing them with this expression. No, not with that expression. Eo demai. I think I've left something out. It's one of the things you discover when you're demoi. One of the things that you discover is that if you're a bad speller in English, you're probably going to be a bad speller in Greek too. Okay, eo demoi. Now, your translator cleans it up a little bit. My maidens, it's really slaves. And she laments. And then, a little bit further down the page, line 156, she addresses fate or God. It should be this way, and this should be this way, as eo what is it? Yeah, daimon. Okay. So this is in her description of the funeral rites. So the words are close enough in terms of their sounds to suggest a comparison between the activity of slaves in relation to masters and the relation of Orestes to his fate. Now, daimon means fate, but can also mean God. The chorus then emphasize the barbaric character of their song and make a reference to the origin of the problems of the house of Atreus with Tantalus. That story, Orestes, it's only alluded to here. That story, Euripides actually lays out in some detail in his Electra. It's on your page 254, it's line 700. Following an Electra, you get this. Among hoary traditions, the tale abides that Pan, the guardian of the fields, conducted a lamb with a comely fleece all golden from its tender mother on the Argive hills by breathing a sweetly trilling melody upon his harmonious reeds. Upon steps of stone, the herald took his stand and proclaimed, to the public square, Mycenaeans, and see the wonder that foreshadows a blessed reign to him that owns it. And it was the house of Atreus they honored with dances. The gold-decked temples were opened, and through the city fire blazed upon the altars of the Argives. The lotus flute, the muses' minister, uttered forth a beautiful strain, and lovely songs were multiplied in praise of the golden lamb, of Thyestes, for he had seduced Atreus' dear wife to his clandestine couch, and to his own house had borne off the prodigy, namely the golden lamb, the beginning of the Golden Fleece. He returns to the assembly and declares he possesses in his own house the horned creature with the golden fleece. Then did Zeus change the gleaming stars in their course. And it's the beginning of a story where Zeus actually changes the direction of the rising and falling of the sun in order to protest the theft of the golden fleece by Thyestes. So that's what's referred to here. Now, finally, some of this stuff will come together in a minute. Iphigenia picks up again on the daimon problem at line 203 to 235. She says, from the beginning, my daimon has been deus daimon. From the beginning, my fate has been an ill fate or a bad fate. Now, this points to an ambiguity throughout the play with regard to this word, daimon. It can mean fate, check lines 157, 202, 203 to 4. It can mean God, check line 267, 391, 570. But the two senses are not altogether compatible when you look at the difference between line 203 to 4. Hold on. I'm in the wrong, okay. Where we get this, from the beginning my life has been cursed. That's from the beginning my daimon has been a deus daimon. And then you get later on a speech in which she says that, where is it? Where she says about line 391, for my part, I do not believe that Tantalus spread a banquet for the gods at which they enjoyed a child for victuals. It is the men of this land, I believe, being themselves murderers, who lay their own guilt on the gods. No god, no daimon, I'm sure, can be bad. So on the one hand, my daimon has been deus daimon. On the other hand, no daimon can be bad. Now, next thing, look at her exchange with the herdsman and his report. The first thing you notice is that we get more doubleness. The fisherman reports the confrontation with Orestes and Pylades in line 260 through 280. They all see the same thing. To some of them, Orestes and Pylades are either gods or the agalmata, the statues of gods. To some of them, they're simply wayward sailors. Orestes, again, sees only one thing in this section. He mistakes the dogs and the cattle of the Taurians for the Furies. So Orestes mistakes what things mean, images, for what they are. Now, this, of course, has been characteristic of Iphigenia from the beginning. Given the importance of human sacrifice for the play, the fact that she so easily collapses the distinction between anointing or preparing the victims and killing them is strange. But is even this true? Look at line 258 to 59. They need to be retranslated, so I don't know why I'm telling you to look at them. But go back to that point. Tell me where you caught them and how I wish to know. They've been a long time coming. The goddesses alter, and you have has waited long for the red streams of Hellenic blood. It's really the goddess's altar, never yet with the red streams of Hellenic blood. So this points really to one of the very strangest puzzles in the play. It's such a problem that some of the editors delete these lines completely, and Hoddes has simply fudged it and translated it so the contradiction doesn't come to the surface. Now, if you remember, Pylades had said back at line 73 that the altar was red or xanthos, brown, auburn, with stains of blood. So that seems to settle it. There's blood on the altar. But right after Iphigenia makes her puzzling remark, the herdsman gratuitously introduces into his story the fact that when they capture Orestes and Pylades, the capture occurs near a shelter for those who are fishing for porphyra. Now, porphyra is the fish from which purple dye is made. That's at line 263. Just a little later at line 303, he mentions kokloi, conchs, from which purple dye is also made. Now, in the Iliad, in the 17th book, on line 361, Homer uses the word porphyreos, porphyr-like, to describe the color of the blood spilt by Ajax when he slays Trojans. And in his play The Persians, line 317, Aeschylus uses the same word to describe the color of a beard that's stained with blood from battle. So what have we got? We've got, on line 73, a blood-stained altar. And then we have a claim at line 258, 59, that no Hellenic blood, and therefore no blood, since the ancient law specifies the sacrifice of Greek men, no blood has yet been spilled on the altar. And finally, we get the gratuitous introduction of material for making dye the color of blood. Line 263, line 303. So, are we meant to wonder whether the human sacrifice practiced by the Taurians might be an elaborate fake? In a way, this is just silly. It's obviously impossible. In fact, we're told that Iphigenia has a letter to show Orestes, written by somebody who didn't hold it against her that she killed him. That's at line 584. He pitied her and judged her, not her hand, but the law responsible for his death. So he can only be talking about the law that prescribes the death for captive Greek men. So it looks as though at least one Greek man has died on the altar. So what's going on? Euripides seems to have made it impossible to solve this difficulty on the level of the plot. On the one hand, contrary to our initial impression, there has never been a sacrifice performed, never been a human sacrifice performed at this altar. On the other hand, it looks as though evidence in the play itself shows that at least one sacrifice has been performed. Now, you know what I do when I get backed into a situation like this, where it looks as though there's this contradiction impossible to resolve within a play or a piece of philosophical writing. you need to try at least to ask the question of whether the contradiction might just be the point that you're meant to see. So we're meant to learn what human sacrifice really is by being forced to wonder whether a human sacrifice has actually been performed. By wondering whether it's been performed, we're meant to learn what it means for a human being to be sacrificed. So why did Agamemnon sacrifice Iphigenia? He was told, he was fulfilling his oath to sacrifice, line 23, the most beautiful thing a year would bear. Much as at Genesis 22:2, Abraham is told to sacrifice his only son whom he loves. So it looks as though these two paradigms of human sacrifice mean to show us that human sacrifice has meaning only insofar as we're sacrificing what's most important to us, our own most thing. So piety, genuine piety, the deepest manifestation of piety, demands that the gods be given what we most value. A lamb may be dear, a deer may be dear, but a human being is more dear. So you understand it in this way, and you realize that sacrificing one's child is supposed to be an act of extraordinary piety. At the same time, the very moment a human being is placed on the altar, its humanity is in some way diminished, becomes a means to an end, a tool. That's why in the Iphigenia at Aulis, Euripides ends the play not by having Iphigenia dragged to the altar, but by her deciding to go voluntarily. It's the only way that he can preserve, on the one hand, the magnitude of the sacrifice. So, on the one hand, the greatest piety requires human sacrifice. On the other hand, to sacrifice a human being is somehow to render it less than it was. It's no longer the greatest sacrifice, just another animal to be burned and eaten. So the gods seem to place an impossible demand on us. No sacrifice is finally sufficient unless it's what is most dear, most our own. And yet, in sacrificing it, our own ceases to be our own. So, the Iphigenia among the Taurians is ambiguous with regard to the question of human sacrifice, because human sacrifice is itself ambiguous. To perform it is, in a way, not to perform it. Human sacrifice is impossible. So, is there a way out of this dilemma? The Iphigenia among the Taurians begins with an acknowledgement that what was thought to be a human sacrifice wasn't really. Iphigenia was wafted away by Artemis at the last minute. So is that really meant to be the paradigm? Not the exception, but in a way the paradigm for human sacrifice? At the last minute, a human being gets turned into an animal. So the Greeks, altogether unaware of the change, who knows, maybe human flesh tastes like venison, have to be taught its significance. this play, the instrument of their education, is meant to make them fully Greek. So Iphigenia still confuses the intent, the acknowledgement of meaning or significance of sacrifice with the actual act. She conflates her job with that of those who actually cut throats. She assumes that because her dream showed her performing the rites of her office over Orestes, that this is identical to the death of Orestes. So she makes a typically barbarian mistake by conflating the name, the significance, with the thing. This is Thoos as swift, or every carpenter has the name carpenter. The way out seems to be something like Hosias Hecate, for the sake of the holy. The Iphigenia, which is about thwarted human sacrifice, is in fact about the fact that the only truly human sacrifice is ritual, fake sacrifice. That seems to be where Euripides is going. So this is back to what you asked about at the beginning. You could say, the play is about this thing that happened. Iphigenia, Agamemnon was told that he had to sacrifice his daughter Iphigenia, what was most dear to him, in order to go to Troy. So he did it and thought that he had done it, and Clytemnestra obviously thought that he had done it. But at the last moment, without their knowing it, Iphigenia was switched. There was a switch, and Artemis inserted a deer on the altar and took Iphigenia away. So I guess in a way the suggestion is simple, that looks like a great reversal of the sacrifice, but it may be that Euripides is reflecting rather deeply on what it means, what it would mean to sacrifice a human being, and suggesting that there's something fundamentally contradictory about it, because the only reason to do it is that human beings are so important. They are more important than any other living thing, and therefore their sacrifice is to sacrifice them is to sacrifice the most important living thing, on the one hand. And then on the other hand, it turns out that as soon as you've been induced to do that, you're now treating human beings just the way you would treat animals. And therefore, there's nothing special about your act suggests there's really nothing special about them at all. And if there's nothing special about them at all, they're no longer the single most important thing. So it turns out that you have to, on the one hand, find a way of indicating your willingness to sacrifice the thing that is most dear without actually doing it. This is Euripides really reflecting on how important this issue of ritual is. We're only halfway through, so we're not even halfway through the play, we're halfway through our treatment of the play. So we'll see what happens later, but this strikes me as, in a way, so far, the most interesting thing about the play. Yeah, I think that, so that if you push it, the question would be, it would be very interesting to see what it would mean and whether there's a play about the need to sacrifice a god So I can give you the stock answer, sensible answer, and I think it's in some way the correct answer, which is you're showing that the most important thing to you is the God by sacrificing everything else, even what is otherwise the most important thing to you, to show you that nothing compares to your devotion to the gods. And therefore you single out this extremely special thing and say, I'm willing to sacrifice even that. And the difficulty is that it looks barbaric. And so the question is, why does it look barbaric? Well, it looks barbaric because to treat a human being that way is to treat a human being like a hunk of meat. And if you treat a human being like a hunk of meat, that doesn't look like you're thinking of it as a very important thing. So the decision to sacrifice this very special thing to the gods deprives it of its specialness. And since it happens to be what you are, it looks as though there's something slavish about the behavior that was meant to be noble. This is Euripides showing you that in a certain sense, even if you don't realize it, every sacrifice is necessarily a ritual sacrifice because it doesn't exist without the meaning that's attached to the object that you're sacrificing. Once you realize that, you realize that the crucial thing is the meaning and not the actual object. It looks as though you can finesse the whole thing by simply doing what you're doing on the level of the meaning. You don't have to kill anybody, you just have to go to a tragedy. Now, the difficulty is, always the difficulty is that that only seems to make sense if, in fact, you're genuinely moved by the ceremony that you're participating in. And so the real difficulty is that Hosias Hecate tends willy-nilly to move from for the sake of the whole, to slide from for the sake of the holy to for form's sake. And the question is what that means, and if that's to be avoided, how that's to be avoided. Now, Euripides seems to have it in mind to say, among other things, listen, any civilization needs public festivals, public rituals that have as their goal the reanimation of the meaning of ritual. But of course, the difficulty with that is that such rituals are themselves rituals, and that's subject to the problem of Hosias Hecate as every other ritual is. So I think we have a ways to go to see how this might be worked out. But so far, I think on the level of the problem, we see that on the one hand, in order for life to be serious, it has to have meaning. In order to have meaning, the things that we think of as though they're simply real have to be in a way ritual, in the sense that they're combinations of meaning and action. And the difficulty is that as soon as we identify them as ritual, we run the risk that they become something like pure meaning, cut free from any actual reality. No real blood, just the idea of spilling blood. But the idea of spilling blood's a lot easier than the actual spilling of blood. So we have another version of the problem of pathemathos, of learning through experience or learning through suffering. What exactly that combination really amounts to seems to be what's at issue here.